Ladies and gentlemen, shalom from Israel. It's now a little bit after 7:30 Israel time PM. Thank you for joining this webinar, Israel-Iran War. Today is June 15, Sunday, day 3 of this war. My presentation today have a couple of major segments. We'll try to address the situation from different perspectives. I would like to start, as always, with some sort of like general framing, which is significant for understanding the current situation. We'll talk then about Israel's military tactic, different perspective on that issue, and then concluding with some attempt to look ahead, at least at the foreseeable future, where things are leading to. So starting with the general framing, the Mullah regime that came to power in Iran in 1979 has become a very dominant and unfortunately negatively influencing factor across the region. One of the major things that the Mullah regime was unfortunately able to very successfully develop is this equation and mechanism or system that was basically aimed to serve the Mullah's regime hegemonic vision. This is a system that you could see in front of you in the shape of this triangle that has three major components. One is the nuclear program, the other one is the local proxies, the network of armies of terror that that regime has been creating, nurturing, establishing. You may be familiar with some of those names: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip and the West Bank, Houthis, Iraqi Shiite militias, and others. And the final component of that stool, if I could figuratively describe it, is the missiles and drones capacities. This is a very sophisticated system that its core value is that it basically creates the ultimate insurance policy for the Mullah regime. In other words, each and every one of the components of this triangle is actually serving as the one that defends the other two components. The nuclear component is basically supposed to shelter both the local proxies and the missiles. The missiles are supposed to shelter the nuclear and the local proxies. The local proxies are supposed to shelter the nuclear and the missiles program of the Mullah regime. In other words, what the Mullah regime was very successfully, unfortunately, able to create is this system that provided the Mullah regime with ultimate immunity, sort of speaking. And indeed, when you look at the impact of this regime across the region for the last 4 decades, you could see that unfortunately the regime was very successfully promoting its agenda, very effectively using and implementing this model of ultimate insurance, and the regime in Iran basically built himself an image and position of a win-win situation where the regime on the one hand was able to inflict through its different mechanisms an enormous death and destructions across the Middle East, and at the same time remains totally immune from ramifications. When we are looking today at what happens, the Israel-Iran war, actually the script has been on the wall for a long period of time, and a pivotal moment in that regard is the event that is known as October 7. We are all familiar with that event and the following of that event. The significance of October 7 in the context of the current Israel-Iran war is that October 7 actually generated the domino effect, leading to the point where right now we are witnessing this direct, wide-scale military collision between Israel and Iran. The major component that led to this point, this domino effect that I was referring to, is the fact that towards the end of 2025, basically what we see is that a major component of this three-leg stool, and I'm referring to the proxies network, that major component has been significantly weakened. What we are looking today is actually a situation where a conjunction of circumstances and developments starting in October 7 resulted in the creation of a strategic window of opportunity that basically encouraged Israeli government's decision to launch military strike on Iran and actually to wage a war on the Iranians. This strategic window of opportunity is made of the following components: the weakening of the axis of resistance, particularly the defeat of Hezbollah, the most significant component of the axis of resistance as an outcome of the war with Israel, and of course the weakening of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others. The other thing is the increasing and deepening challenges within Iran, economically, socially, environmentally. And the third thing is the new administration in the United States, Trump administration, that basically deepened sanctions on the mullah's regime. The combination, the conjunction of these three factors resulted in this window of opportunity where basically the Israeli government made the decision to launch this war against Iran and Iran's nuclear military project and capacities. So when we are trying to assess the major trigger for that dramatic move, I would say that the major trigger is first and foremost the identification of this window of opportunity that lead us to where we are right now. So when we look at the Israeli moves from a military perspective, the tactic that Israel has applied by launching the war, it's interesting to notice that this is actually a very well carefully thought, tailored, comprehensive blueprint program that brings in at the same time, in different priorities and in different gradual structure, different components that aims to achieve some major achievements in the very early phase of this war. One of the first things that Israel is doing immediately, as you probably know, in the very first hours of the attack, is to take out the chain of command, senior leadership of the major military infrastructures and establishments in Iran. There are a couple of different military major establishments in Iran. One of them is the Iranian army, and the other one, the most significant one, is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. All leaders of those major establishments were taken out in the first hours of the Israeli attack. The reason for that was to cripple the chain of command, and the logic beyond it was not only the psychological impact of such an attack and the fact that the Israeli intelligence was able to get in a pinpoint high resolution whereabouts of those leaders in every place, but not less significant, the idea beyond it was to cripple and disrupt the whole chain of command. That is the one significant for the expected Iranian retaliation. In parallel to that, Israel is targeting another group of people, and this is what we call the armament group. These are the core scientists, sort of speaking, camp that is the most significant one in the context of future Iranian nuclear military capacities. In other words, this is a group that has been known by this name of the armament group that has been operating until 2003. And its major mission in the end of the day is to weaponize nuclear military capacity into a warheads that in the end of the day are basically becoming nuke. And that's the reason why Israel is targeting in the very first hours and later people that are coming from that specific group. The other target that Israel focused in immediately are particularly two major nuclear sites in Iran. One is in Natanz and the other one is in Isfahan. You could see in front of you on the map, they are centered, roughly speaking, in the center western part of Iran. In Natanz, there is the process of the enriching of the uranium. Isfahan is the place where there is a process of transforming this liquid formation of uranium back into a solid situation or a solid formation, which is essential in the end of the day towards the final phase of producing nuclear military capacities. The Israeli attacks on those two major sites aims first and foremost to block at this point further continuation of the work or the process of work in both nuclear sites. Notice the significant one of them, the Fordo. You could see it above Natanz. This is the major nuclear military site. There has been some sort of an Israeli attack, but it was kind of like, relatively speaking, more limited in comparison to the two others that I mentioned before. Parallel to that, Israel is starting to immediately to attack Iran's ballistic missiles in two major aspects. One is attacking the depot of those missiles stored across Iran, and the other thing is to attack the launchers of those missiles. There are different estimations regarding the numbers of ballistic missiles in Iran. I would say that we are looking at something around 1,000 or maybe more ballistic missiles. The major component of those ballistic missiles have in two major perspectives. One is the whole fueling process of the ballistic missiles, a process that has to take some time. And the other thing is the launchers. This is the most critical component. There are estimated couple of hundreds of launchers. Some of those launchers are mobile, on the ground. Some of them are under the ground. If the process of fueling and launching is taking almost totally under the ground, then you got less time to be able to intercept. If the process of the fueling and the launching is taking place while it's taking place all above the ground, you have a longer period of time to try and to intercept the launching of the missiles. And finally, the crucial, critical component of the Israeli blueprint of this opening part of this military phase was to establish what the Israeli commander of the Israeli Air Force says, an Israeli controlled aerial corridor. As of now, it seems that Israel has been able to establish a controlled aerial corridor stretching all the way from Israel to Iran, where Israeli jets are basically flying almost undisturbedly across Iran from side to side. The Iranian skies are actually now under Israeli Air Force control. And so what we see almost since the first moment of this whole thing was this never-ending flow of Israeli jets that are attacking in waves Iranian targets in Iran. And basically what we see is sort of like a train where jets are coming back and forth. They are almost not facing any significant challenge from the ground because they have been able to eliminate the Iranian radars and anti-aerial capacities and infrastructure. And by that, basically, Israel ensured itself an aerial superiority in Iran. And basically, the Israeli Air Force is almost free to act freely across Iran, as we see that constantly according to the reports. So these have been the major, I would say, components of the Israeli military tactics and logic that has been leading this whole very first phase of the attack, starting in the night between Thursday and Friday, and continuing and expanding and widening, because the more Israel was able to create itself this aerial space of control, the more Israel is able to expand and verify the nature of the targets that the Israeli Air Force is targeting. As you probably, of course, know, on the other side, the Iranian regime started to attack Israel with shooting ballistic missiles and drones from Iran. Up until now, there has been 7 waves of Iranian attacks, launching a couple of hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones towards Israeli cities. As you probably know, most of those missiles and drones have been successfully intercepted, but unfortunately, some of them has been able to penetrate the Israeli defense system. Some of them hit massively arid population in Israel, in the center and in the north, resulting in so far the killing of 15 Israeli civilians and injured of hundreds. The places that were hit by those missiles have also sustained a very significant damage. We are looking at a very heavy missiles. Each one of those missiles contains hundreds and hundreds of pounds of explosives. There are even bigger missiles that the Iranians have in their possession. To the best of my knowledge, up until now, they have not been using those missiles. And so at this point, at least, what we are looking at is the continuation of situation. Israeli Air Force is continuing to operate freely in the Iranian sky, widening and deepening damage to Iranians' military, technological infrastructure. By the way, interesting enough, in the last couple of hours, incoming report indicating that Israel started to expand its attacks also to some sort of like civilian affiliated infrastructure, like, for example, fuel depots or electricity or gas supplying system. However, at this point, to the best of my knowledge, Israel refrained from targeting Iran's most significant asset, and this is, of course, the oil field. And in my assessment, at this point at least, that policy is not going to change. I would say that the Israeli attacks that we witnessed in the last couple of hours, expanding beyond the very clear military targets, but also now targeting those domestically affiliated infrastructures, like I mentioned before, the gas, for example, or the fuel depots, basically, I would say, has two messages, sort of speaking. One is trying to increase pressure from Iran, within Iran, of the population, maybe hoping that that will result in a process that will bring the downfall of Iranian regime. There has been incoming reports in the last couple of hours. Many Iranians are fleeing from major cities, particularly Tehran, the center of Iran. And the other reason is an Israeli message to the Iranians that continuation of the indiscriminately attacking with missiles Israeli urban areas will result in an increasing and escalating Israeli attacks that will not be only solely confined to clearly militarily affiliated infrastructure in Iran, but something that will go beyond it to public infrastructure. And in that regard, we should remind ourselves that already to start with, those infrastructures in Iran are in a very bad or shaky situation. There has been before the war already a lot of challenges in Iran in terms of supplying of electricity, gas, fuel, and so on and so on. And so that may be also one way that Israel signals the Iranian regime that the tactic of the Iranian regime of indiscriminately attacking Israeli urban centers will be met with an increasing, deepening, and widening Israeli attacks that goes beyond the clearly, purely militarily affiliated infrastructure as we witnessed thus far. So we are now day 3 into this war. At this point, we are trying to look ahead and understand where things may be leading to. And I would like to bring some couple potential aspects or angles to in that regard. I think that at this point, we are looking at an escalation and expansion of the hostilities, the volume and the scale of the attacks. In that regard, I think that we could see some interesting difference between the tactics applied by both sides. Starting with the Israeli side, clearly, once Israel has been able to establish this controlled aerial corridor that basically provides the Israeli Air Force almost unlimited access to the Iranian sky, that obviously provides Israel with the ability to expand and extend the attacks on different targets in Iran and across Iran. Interesting enough, at the first phase, the attacks were mostly focusing on the western and center part of Iran and the northwest. Now there has been report that the attacks have been extended also to the eastern part of Iran, thus, of course, increasing the range of flight from Israel to those specific areas in the eastern part of Iran. By doing that, Israel basically has a better ability to reach more and more assets of the Mullah regime and to reach more and more infrastructure, thus increasing pressure from inside on the Mullah regime. From the Mullah regime perspective, I would say it's interesting to see that opposing to first estimations, there were estimations that the Mullah regime is going to retaliate with shooting of hundreds and hundreds of missiles at once and sending huge amounts of swarms of drones. That has not been the tactic, relatively speaking, so far. And it's very clear because when you compare it to the Israeli-Iranian collision twice in 2024, back then the Iranian regime was applying the tactic of sending swarms of drones and hundreds of ballistic missiles. That has not been the case so far, even though up until today, this is day 3 of the war, there has been total of 7 Iranian waves of ballistic shooting and drones. Each one of them, roughly speaking, couple of dozens of ballistic missiles, total something around a couple of hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones that have been thus far launched from Iran. As I said, it is estimated that the Iranians has something like 1,000, maybe more, ballistic missiles in their possession. By the way, they have not been using all kind of the ballistic missiles. They still have even larger missiles that they can use with much more explosives, warheads, and of course, with all the ramifications that come along with it. It seems as if, and I'm saying it very cautiously, that the Iranian regime currently is applying a tactic of much more economic, sort of speaking, use of the arsenal of the missiles it has in its possession. Hence, we see, relatively speaking, less numbers of incoming missiles. But once again, we have to be very cautious about it. It could change. One thing I think is quite clear. It's very clear, I think, that the Iranian regime is kind of like doing a very calculated manners of preserving these capacities to enable itself as much as possible longer breath, sort of speaking, down the road. And that, of course, would be one of the things that in the end of the day will dictate the time frame of that war that we are witnessing right now. In that regard, there are different estimations. I think that most of the experts agree that the scenario of dragging into an exhaustion war that could last months and months is less likely to take place. Most of the experts agree that we are not likely to see a repetition of the Russian-Ukrainian war on the one hand. On the other hand, it's very difficult to really set the time frame of the conflict. Some are talking about a couple of weeks. Some are narrowing that to a less, even maybe a week or 10 days. It's very difficult, of course, at this point to determine the duration of that. Obviously, the most significant thing in the end of the day will be at what point the sides will come to the conclusion that continuation of the situation is much more counterproductive for them than ending the situation. That will be the point where the sides will be able to define their exit point, sort of speaking, of this current confrontation. Meanwhile, another thing that we have to look very carefully closer is the whole issue with the Iranian proxies that I mentioned before. Houthis, before the war and following the war, continues the ritual, sort of speaking, of attacking Israel, but they are doing that quite similar in the same scale that they have been doing that before the war, meaning it's kind of like drizzling of a missile here and a missile there. Interesting enough, Houthis are coming under criticism in the Arab world because people in the Arab world are saying to the Houthis, okay, now you master your major patron, the one that provides you with the missiles and the know-how and the knowledge, Iran. Now they are under attack. Why are you not coming in full capacity to support your patrons? The Houthis are basically saying our intervention before the war and following the war is centered around the issue of supporting the people of Gaza and reaching a ceasefire in Gaza. We are not necessarily directly, automatically connected to the Iranian part of this story. Interesting enough, similar position is expressed by another significant proxy of the Iranians, and these are the Iraqi Shiite militias. In fact, today, the commander of those militias, made an interesting statement, roughly basically saying Iran can take care of itself. It has the capacities, it has the power, we trust Iran. They don't really need us, which is clearly a situation where the Iraqi Shiite militias are not so much eager to be dragged into the war as of now. That stems, among other things, from the fact that in Iraq, following this domino effect of October 7, in Iraq there has been strengthening of the Iraqi national camp at the expense of those Iranian-backed Iraqi Shiite militias. Iraq is now heading shortly to an elections. That are definitely some of the things that I would say quite clearly, at least for now, dictate the, I would say, neutral position of those Iraqi Shiite militias. And that brings us to the most significant and most powerful one, and this is, of course, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Again, going back to the story of October 7 and the domino effect October 7 generated, one of the most significant outcome of this story was the defeat of the Hezbollah in the war with Israel. By the way, a defeat that has been described by Arab analysts that's something that is equal to the defeat of the Arab armies in the war with Israel in 1967. A sentiments that professionally covered this region for 40 years have not come across up until now. So the defeat of the Hezbollah in the war with Israel basically to a large extent dictate as of now the Hezbollah remain on the sideline. But it has to be very clear, the Hezbollah still retain a very significant military capacities, particularly its drones and missiles and rockets capacities provided to the Hezbollah by the Iranians. But as of now, the Hezbollah is standing on the sideline. The leader of the Hezbollah today, Naim Qassem, basically made a statement and saying very similar to the Iraqi Shiite militias, basically saying, of course, Iran can take care, we stand by Iran, we condemn Israel, but he did not make any commitment of the Hezbollah to be part of that war, at least as of now. I would say that we can attribute that Hezbollah position to two major components. One is the fact that, as I said before, the Hezbollah is licking its wound. Following the war, there is a lot of destruction in the south part of Lebanon, particularly, but also in Hezbollah's major stronghold, the Dahya, the southern quarter in Beirut. And the other reason I would say is that the Lebanese current government and president, and needless to say, Lebanese public opinion, sends very robust, very firm message to the Hezbollah, basically saying to the Hezbollah, do not drag us to this war like you did following October 7. Do not drag us to this war. We have suffered enough. We don't want to be part of that war. These are two major things that, as of now, apparently dictates the fact that the Hezbollah is on the sideline. But we have to watch that very carefully because it could change. And if the Hezbollah is going to be involved in the war, that brings already another significant layers to the whole story that could have a lot of ramifications. We have to stay tuned and follow that thing very closely. One other thing that is constantly out there, either in the public discussion or some kind of like in an inner sort of like, sort of speaking, hinted discussion, is whether this whole war actually, in the end of the day, aims to bring down this mullah regime in Iran. I would start as a statement saying, the world really will be a much better place without that regime, radical regime, brutal regime, oppressive regime that has inflicted death and destruction across the region and upon its people since day one when it came to power back in the late 1970s. This is a big question. In other words, will this war result in, whether intentionally or unintentionally, a domino effect that will generate, in the end of the day, the downfall of this regime in Tehran? There are different perspectives. Some argues that the war actually could result in, ironically speaking, a situation where the Iranian people, most of whom resent and loathe that regime, they have been brutally oppressed by the regime, but ironically, they will come around that regime because of sentiment of loyalty, patriotism, nationalism, and so on and so on. There is another perspective that argues the totally opposite, that the continuation of the war and the damage that the mullah regime and its power centers sustains thus far and probably will sustain more the war expand and deepens and intensified, that will result in a process that will boost existing widespread sentiment of resentment and hatred towards the regime that could maybe potentially result in a process of mass uprising of people in Iran, resulting in the downfall of the mullah regime. As of now, it is mostly, I would say, kind of like more towards the wishful thinking end. There are indicators of sort of growing voices of criticism, unrest, protest, and so on inside Iran. But I would say that it's premature at this point to come forward and to deduct that downfall of the mullah regime is just around the corner, not negating the possibility that the continuation and escalation of this conflict would almost inevitably result and generate such a process. But we also have to take into consideration this is a regime that has been brutally oppressing these people. It has enough of oppressive mechanisms that it has developed and sustained all those years that enable this regime, in the end of the day, every time there has been rise up of people, that regime was, in the end of the day, using those oppressive, brutal means, was able to shut down the protest and the uprising. So it's a big question at this point. And finally, of course, the significant question: what is the end game here? What is the end game? I think it has to be clear that Israel cannot eliminate totally the Iranian nuclear program and project. We are looking, in the end of the day, at something huge that has been built over decades, mostly physically speaking, talking about the different sites, the different locations, the amount of knowledge that has been gathered in Iran, the advanced stages of the Iranian nuclear program, whether for civilian purposes and or maybe for military purposes. All those things, in the end of the day, that are under the title of the Iranian nuclear program, in the end of the day, we are looking at something that cannot be totally outruled or totally eliminated. I think that it's very clear for all people and all factors that are involved. The question is, in the end of the day, if that is the purpose, what in the end of the day should be the, I would say, realistic objective, at least from the Israeli perspective and the Western powers that are involved in the whole story of this Iranian nuclear military threat. I think that it's kind of like across the board, there is a consensus that in the end of the day, what we are looking at is a military move that has been orchestrated and, by the way, have been cooked and brewed for a long period of time, of course, and planned, but a military move that was taking place from a military perspective, an operational perspective, and I do emphasize these two terms, that was taking place from military and operational perspective in the most right window of opportunity, so to speaking, because I was explaining it before. And in the end of the day, the whole idea is that this military move, the purpose is to restart negotiation process, but from a place where the mullah regime is much more weakened and therefore much more willing to make compromises that it was not willing to do thus far. This is, I think, the overarching consensus, I would say, among specialists and experts that are looking at this whole situation. I think it's quite clear that at this point, the United States is basically, I would say, using, quote unquote, Israeli military might in order to generate that process. From the Israeli perspective, as I said before, the Israeli decision makers, both the military, the intelligence, and the political one, basically realized that this is an ultimate window of opportunity for the reasons that I was explaining in the beginning of my presentation. The big question, of course, is at what point, what will it take for the sides to come to the conclusion that this is the time for them to exit the round of military collision and to restart the negotiation process. I would say that from the Israeli perspective, the point where Israel will come to the conclusion that it is time maybe to exit this circle will be only when Israel will realize that there is a good chance that moving to an exit point will result in the end of the day, the end goal as far as Israel is concerned, and that is to make sure that the ability of the Iranian regime to move towards the developing of nuclear military capacity, that ability will be significantly reduced. I don't know to say totally reduced or totally eliminated, but very significantly reduced, both in terms of the stages of development as well as the stages of the physical capacities to do that. So this is from the Israeli side. From the Mullah regime side, I would say that the key component for such decision of an exit point is when and if the Mullah regime will come to the conclusion that continuation of the situation, the widening of the attacks, the deepening impact of the attacks is presenting a significant, serious challenge to the endurance and the survival of this Mullah regime. In that regard, we need to add another component that is not so much emphasized in the discussion, but it's enormously significant, and particularly when you're talking about the Middle East, and particularly when you're talking about it in the context of Iran, and this is the psychological impact. We have to remember that while the Mullah regime for the last 4 decades has been inflicting death and destruction across the Middle East, Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, Israelis, Iraqis, Yemenites, and others paid enormously for the destructive role of the Mullah regime and its proxies. At the same time, Iran was totally immune from any ramifications. The people in Iran did not experience in the last 4 decades what people in the Middle East have been experiencing constantly on a daily basis because of the impact of the Mullah's regime. Now you got a situation where the people of Iran are basically tasting some of this bitter pill that people of the region has been tasting. This is something very significant in terms of the psychological mindset, because it goes back to the question of, is it going to result in an uprising in Iran to the point the Mullah regime will be facing a potential downfall? The answer for that is that this psychological impact, one of the most significant and immediate impact, is that it is to a large extent eroding one of the most significant power pillars of the Mullah regime or any other brutal regime as we know in the history, and that is the ability of the regime to terrorize and to make people fear to the point they will be paralyzed and unable to even think about uprising against the regime. The war right now with Iran joins to the previous process of the domino effect that I was talking about, starting in October 7. And that war right now in Iran basically is stripping Iran of one of its most significant assets, and that is the image of non-touchable and immune regime that is totally immune from any ramification, and a regime that is very solid and stable. Now what we see is a picture of a regime that is very vulnerable. The stool is kind of like shaking, and one of the significant components, and we have to take it into consideration when we think about it, is the fact that these moves thus far, since the beginning of this war, indicated that Israel has penetrated across the board of this regime to the most deepest places of its power centers and so on and so on. So in that regard, this is of course a major component we have to see or try to assess what's going to be the impact of that in the context of the continuation and duration of this military collision that we see right now taking place in front of us. This is a pivotal moment in the story of the region. This is a moment of tectonic plate movement. I was asked in one of my many interviews and assessment if there is a reason to be optimistic. It's very difficult at this time, as you could understand, both for the people of Israel and Iranian people that have to experience this stormy reality. Unfortunately, people are killed on both sides. This is, of course, a very terrible reality. But my answer is that I do believe that once we will exit this situation, we could exit to a landscape of the region that is relatively more promising in the sense that because when we look up until now at the situation, particularly the last couple of decades, you see that unfortunately it was a landscape that mostly characterized by a constant instability and violence across the region, to a large extent generated by this regime and its proxies. So maybe once we get out of this situation, this episode, and hopefully it wouldn't take long, maybe we could expect to exit to a better environment, to a better landscape. At this point, this is kind of like, I would say, a hope. I do hope that in course of time, that hope will be materialized on the ground. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my briefing. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. Stay tuned for further updates. Be well, stay well. Thank you.